So now we will go to them one by one. Hedonism. Hedonism is a form of consequentialism which claims that pleasure is the only intrinsic good and that pain is the only intrinsic bad. Hedonism is like equal to the value of the consequences, depends only on the pleasures and pains in the consequences, as opposed to the other supposed goods such as freedom, knowledge, life, and so on. Hedonism is an ethical theory which holds that the supreme end of human person consists in the acquisition of pleasure and that actions are good or bad according to whether they give or do not give worldly pleasure or temporal happiness to man. Morality, therefore, is grounded on the pleasure or satisfaction that an act brings or entails. The good action is the pleasant action, and then the bad action is what produces pain. Under hedonism, we have egoistic hedonism and psychological hedonism. In egoistic hedonism, the contention which is valued is that man is primarily obligated to seek for his own pleasure, even if it means the deprivation of others. This is of course destructive, so there's a need to provide sanctions to the excessive demands of pleasure if it were desired only for the sake of self-gratification. In psychological hedonism, the contention that man by nature is capable of doing only those actions which give him pleasure and that he avoids those actions that give him pain is embraced. Doing the opposite of this means man's violation of his nature. By nature, it is said that man is subject to two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain. However, this requires that man should only follow what is natural in him, that is, to do an act in the name of pleasure and avoid those actions which render him pain. Two general forms of pleasure, which is the physical and mental. We need to discuss this because as we have heard the definition of hedonism under consequentialism, a lot of thinkers are criticizing consequentialism, accusing it to be a very narrow moral theory because it only bases its criteria on the pleasure and pain. However, here Articulo and Florendo clarifies that hedonism is just part of the forms of consequentialism which which is using the physical pleasure. But there's also another kind of pleasure which is the mental pleasure which is associated to utilitarianism. Understandably, putting the concept of pleasure at the heart of this theory in the hedonism made many detest it as a decent standard of conduct. For everyday men, the idea of happiness or pleasure as the ultimate end of human action is from the very start unethical. Many think this theory of life is worthy only of a swine because of the common idea that pleasure means physical or bodily gratification. The objection is unfounded. Let us clarify this misconception by clarifying that utilitarian precept of pleasure regarding. So again, just one part of pleasure is the physical pleasures. These are sensual indulgences or bodily gratifications that include, among others, sexual intercourse, eating, drinking, rest, etc. Ill-regulated desires make man pursue pleasure to the injury of health, even if man knows that health is a greater good. This kind of pleasure is considered as animalistic or beastly and make up the lower forms or inferior types of pleasure. Physical pleasure appeals to people's lower faculties and persons desiring nothing but physical pleasure are considered lowly and less dignified. Whereas the mental pleasure, which is the one associated to utilitarianism, refers to intellectual, spiritual, and moral pleasures. Mental pleasures feed man's noble feelings, imaginations, and moral sentiments. They are higher or superior form of pleasure, more desirable and more valuable as compared to those of mere sensation. Mental pleasures are generally more difficult to achieve, but make man more dignified. They include, among others, the enjoyment of free will and intellect, social recognition and regards, feeling of self-worth and respect, feeling of peace and security. Mental pleasure is that the utilitarian theory of morality, which appeals to when it calls for the promotion of pleasure or happiness. This corrects the misconception that utilitarianism is a theory worthy of a swine. Human beings have faculties far more elevated than animal appetites, and desire greater pleasure than the pleasure only swine are capable of. Human pride and dignity make man desire a greater form of happiness, even when man's pursuit of happiness leads to personal dissatisfaction. Still thinks he ought not to settle for a beast's pleasures, for these do not satisfy human beings' conceptions of happiness. According to John Stuart Mill, it is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than to be fools satisfied. Mental pleasures for the utilitarians, happiness or pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends. These are the only things that can determine if acts are good or contrary to good. If any act promotes or has promoted happiness or pleasure, regardless of the goodness of its motive, the act is good. Utilitarianism thus rejects any supernatural basis for morality and makes human welfare or human happiness the ultimate standard of right and wrong. At this point, it should be recalled that the utilitarian concept of happiness does not mean the agent's own greatest happiness, but the greatest amount of happiness put together. This means that even the interest of the agent or the doer of the moral act must be sacrificed if it runs contrary to the happiness of the greatest number. Thus, the quality of and quantity of pleasure or happiness are taken into account in the utilitarian moral calculation.